Hello, I'm Dr. Joel B. Goodin. Today I'll be talking about the purpose of the study. So you've just done your problem statement, and we're going to start talking about a concept called alignment. The problem needs to lead to the purpose. And so think of the problem like the fire. A fire, something is on fire that scholars have pointed out. Something needs attention. It needs to be put out or dealt with or intervened. And so that fire is the problem. Whereas what you are going to do about it is the purpose, the intervention, the putting the fire out, the exploration, the determination, identifying factors, understanding something. All of that is the purpose. Here we have some special wording that we typically use depending on your university. You're going to use language something like this, and it's good to use this language, and it's good to keep it consistent throughout your entire dissertation. This is probably the most commonly used sentence that you'll have throughout your entire dissertation. And you want to always keep it the same and never use these two words, the purpose of this study, or even similar words in any different way. In other words, you don't want to ever confuse the reader as to what the purpose of your study is. Okay? So here you're basically in this, you're asked to do three things. Identify the study design here. Identify the methodology. And then identify, the main goal here is to identify your overarching goal of the study. The goal of the dissertation that directly reflects and encompasses the research questions to follow. So, we're going to use words like the purpose of this qualitative phenomenological study is to, and if it's qualitative, you're going to use words like explore or understand, and then insert whatever phenomena you're trying to understand or phenomenon. If it's quantitative, you might be to determine or identify, and you might be trying to identify the effect of variable A on variable B, something like that. And then, of course, your method would be quantitative, and you might have a design that's sort of a correlational design, quasi-experimental. True experiments are sort of rare, but you might have one. Correlational and quasi-experimental are probably the most common. When you're picking out methodology, you're choosing qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods, which means you're going to use both quant and qual. I typically advise my students not to use mixed methods for a dissertation because it overcomplicates a process that it will already be difficult. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just sometimes better to, you can have an impressive dissertation. In fact, you can probably have a more impressive dissertation if you have a sort of a, not necessarily simpler, but a more focused study. And when you get into mixed methods, sometimes you're not able to present that as concisely and in a focused manner. So you want to pick qual or quant, and then you want to pick your research design based on qualitative. It could be ethnographic, phenomenological, a type of case study, a general or basic qualitative study. Those are pretty common designs that you could choose for a qualitative study. And then I just mentioned some quantitative options. And so this language is going to reflect the methodology that you've chosen. Quantitative or qualitative? Probably. And then if it is phenomenological, you'll see the language change a bit more. It might say lived experiences, whereas a case study might say perceptions. Another thing to note here is that you don't really, if it's qualitative, you don't want to get into some sort of perceptions of how variable A affects variable B. You want to just focus on situation or concept A. So you don't want to sort of try to prove anything causal or relational in a qualitative study by sort of interviewing focus groups, whatever it may be. You want to stay away from that and just understand perceptions of whatever it may be, phenomena, perceptions of your dissertation process. Indicate how the study is a logical, explicit research response to the stated problem and the research questions to follow. So up here we're going to have something like the purpose of, and I normally suggest the proposed qualitative case study. I use the proposed and then I insert the methodology, and then the design is to explore the perceptions of African American women toward cultural appropriation, and we could just like stop it there. Let's say that could be an example. So it's pretty straightforward, and you want it to be very straightforward and singular, very focused. And so for a logical explicit response here, I suggest pointing out in a dissertation, you've got sort of judges, a committee watching to see if you're ticking boxes. In fact, here are the boxes I'll be ticking for a certain set of students. And so for these students, I want to see the words logical, explicit response in the sentence. If you point this out, signals to committee that you are covering it. All right, so the sentence might be proposed qualitative case study is a logical, explicit response to the problem. Of course, assuming that we just listed a problem that had to do with this, the problem of let's say I'm making this up. I mean, it could be true, but I do not have that evidence. Okay, so let's say the problem to be addressed is that cultural appropriation leads to negative psychological health outcomes among African American women. Well, what are we going to do about that? We might explore the perceptions of African American women toward cultural appropriation. This might not be the perfect purpose, but I'm just trying to give you a problem and purpose idea. And so by having this problem down here, that it leads to negative psych health outcomes, then we might want to understand that better by exploring their perceptions toward it. If we understand what's really going on, then we might understand why it's leading to negative psychological health outcomes, or if that is even the root cause, or if it's a mediator or moderator. I generally think of qualitative studies as sort of beginning foundational research, and then quantitative studies can often follow qualitative studies in terms of after the groundwork has been laid, we can start to measure things and understand things in more of a statistical way. That will not always be correct, but that's the way I typically think of it. You should have identified the method and design, usually in the subject of the sentence, and include the overarching goal of your study as the predicate of the sentence. The formulaic structure will look like the purpose of the proposed study is to understand, identify, determine, whatever you're doing. So a purpose should not have two, quote, arms. Think of a purpose as having, it should only have one arm. And what I mean by that is, and it shouldn't have 3 or 4 or 5 or any more than one. In other words, it should be singular, inclusive of all that you wish to do. For a qualitative study, it will likely say the purpose is to explore or understand something, while a quantitative study is likely to say the purpose is to identify or determine. And you want to make sure that it doesn't say and. If it has the word and, identify factors that lead to psychological negative psychological health, and why people like karaoke. By adding that second thing, whatever it is, you're sort of adding a second portion to your purpose that is probably going to confuse your readership. In other words, they're not going to know exactly what you do. If you really need to include more than one thing, then you should sort of think on a higher level. So you might have 2 micro level items that you're trying to understand in your purpose, and you might want to go say, okay, what phenomena or what concepts include those 2 things, and go to that singular umbrella topic above it. So instead of, let's, for just simplicity's sake, I want to understand carrots and lima beans. No, we can't use beans. Carrots and spinach. All right, so carrots and spinach. Instead of those 2 things, let's understand vegetables. So, indicate how the study is a logical, explicit response. So the point here is to start pointing out what you're doing by using these signaling words in your sentences. Here we have continue with a brief step-by-step overview of how the study will be conducted. Now, later, you're going to change it to past tense. Don't worry about that for now. You'll come back and say how it was conducted. So, this is about one sentence that will sum up how you will accomplish your purpose. It will include a brief summary of the biggest parts of your research process, the primary form of data collection, the sample size, and concise descriptors of your sample. So you might say something like, to achieve the study's purpose, the researcher will interview 12 to 18 mothers of teenage children. And so, I'll write that down. Of course, this does not match or align with the purpose and problem that we've been talking about. I switched to a different potential topic for the sake of this example. And you can see that misalignment. Obviously, why would we be interviewing these mothers of teenage children if we're studying cultural appropriation among African American women? We would not. They might be mothers of teenage children, but that would not be why we are interviewing them, for instance. Okay. Next, you're asked to identify the variables and constructs, materials, instrumentation, and analysis that you plan to do. This is a very brief and concise identification of details upon which you're going to elaborate a lot more in Chapter 3. So you're just being very quick, brief. First, you're asked to identify the variables and constructs. Variables is normally if you're quantitative, whereas constructs if you're qualitative. Similarly, materials and instrumentation could be both qualitative or quantitative. If you have a qualitative study, your materials and instrumentation, let's say you're doing interviews, you'll likely say an interview guide at the very least. You might, as a qualitative researcher, you might point out that if you want to, and depending on your chair, you might say the researcher is the primary instrument of data collection or research tool. In other words, in qualitative research, we often refer to the researcher as one of the main instruments of a research. Whereas in quantitative research, materials and instrumentation would be maybe the Beck depression inventory or the general self-measure or various other surveys or instruments that actually measure things in terms of variables. And so you want to think about that. And you also want to say how you are going to analyze it. In total, you'll need to be able to identify the variables and constructs, identify the materials and or instrumentation, how you'll perform the data analysis, identify the target population, and then identify the sample size needed for the study. So these are sort of 5 different things going on. So describe your plan for data analysis that will clearly answer your research questions. If you don't have these written yet, you might want to start to work on those simultaneously. Whereas a quantitative study will implement quantitative data analyses like ANOVA or hierarchical regression or structural equation modeling or t-tests or correlational analysis. Qualitative study will require qualitative data analyses, which will include a type of analysis and a type of coding, typically. So it could be content analysis, thematic analysis, and then you've got different types of coding as well. Axial coding. And you want to look into your options to figure out what type of analysis you're doing qualitatively, and then what type of coding you're doing qualitatively. Whereas quantitatively, you want to figure out what you will need to do if it's just one primary f-test, like an ANOVA, or if it's a form, a derivation of the ANOVA, an ANCOVA or a MANCOVA, or if you're doing something like a regression. So many options. Be sure to clearly identify the type of analytical procedures you will use. For quant study, you might mention the use of software like SPSS, SAS, R, M+, to perform a correlational analysis. Qualitative software for analysis is typically referred to as CAQDAS, computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software. And this is probably the most popular, the most famous one, and perhaps the most expensive, I don't know, is in vivo, for example. You should describe the process you will use to analyze the data. For a quantitative study, you might discuss descriptive, like frequencies analyses. You might use to analyze the demographics, or a post hoc analysis like a Bonferroni that you might add to an ANOVA or an ANCOVA, whatever. So here we might have our variables like frequency of eating, duration of exercise. Those would be quantitative options. Those are variables. Constructs might be post-traumatic growth. In terms of materials and instruments, we might have the Beck Depression Inventory, the general self-efficacy measure. If it was qualitative, we might have just something called an interview guide. In terms of analyses, we talked about ANOVA, regression, so many options there. I'm just going to list those. And in terms of qualitative analyses, we might have content analysis with axial coding. So you want to look into your options for coding besides axial. It may not be what you want or need to do. Here, identify the target population. You should already know this. Here, from this purpose statement, we would know that we're probably going to deal with African American women. And we might want to go ahead and add the word adult here, as that implies 18 years of age and older. So this is the general population that we are pulling from. Who are the people that you're pulling from? And and that your study will generalize or transfer to, generally speaking. In other words, you're going to sample maybe, let's say you interviewed 15 African American women. Who do they represent? Do they represent African American all over the world, or just in your city, or just in your region of the South or the Midwest, or do they represent sort of women nationwide in the United States, etc.? Here, we're not going to really get into the specifics of inclusion and exclusion criteria just yet. Instead, we're going to focus on if it's a qualitative study, depending on the design, we're going to use 12 to 18. I typically just aim for 12 to 18 participants, or until saturation is reached. Saturation is the idea that you start hearing the same thing after a certain number of interviews. You start hearing less unique information from your interviewees. And once that happens, it's almost unethical to continue. In other words, say we get to 10 participants and that 10th participant has not said anything that the previous 9 haven't already said. In that case, you might want to cancel any interviews you haven't. Well, you might do one more interview, but you want to not schedule any further interviews unless they're already scheduled. You might keep them. You can work with your chair to discuss how to do that, or you might even reach out to the IRB and say, what do you think? So reaching saturation, going just a bit to make sure that you reach saturation is not a bad idea, but you do not necessarily want to keep going and going and going when you keep hearing the same thing. That's wasting your time and the time of the potential participants. So in terms of sample size, this depends on the design. If it's a qualitative study, it might be smaller with like a ethnographic or phenomenological study. A case study might be bigger. Multiple case study might be even bigger. And in terms of quantitative, you are going to base sample size on power analysis. I'm pretty sure I don't have that right. G plus is probably the most commonly used power analysis software. It is free currently and can be downloaded, I think, to a Mac or PC. And I wouldn't say it's simple, but it's straightforward with a little help. You might need to understand what's going on. If you're going to do, you need to know what type of test, how much effect size you want to have, and then it will tell you, based on what you're trying to do, you need 317 participants minimum. For instance, that's a made-up estimate. And depending on what you're going to do, you don't have to get into it here, but you might say minimum of 317 participants. Due to historically lower response rates to online surveys, and give a citation. And let's say that you're going to do 2,000 participants. So you're going to, or even maybe I should have said more like 3,000. 3,000 participants will be recruited to support efforts to reach a minimum sample size. So online surveys are typically, you do get low response rates, especially when you're not providing compensation. So you want to sort of go ahead and think about that. Again, up here, we were asked to identify the target population and the sample size needed. If it's in the manuscript, after you finish the dissertation, you go back and change and say, this is what I needed and obtained. So, here, identify the site where the research will be. In this example that I just gave, if it's an online survey, maybe I'm using Facebook groups, which could be anybody, anywhere. But maybe I want to limit that to people, African American women in the United States. Therefore, my location would be the United States, online, reached via Facebook. However, what if I'm interviewing people in my city, which is in, let's say, Orlando, Florida? If I'm doing that, I want to limit, especially if it's like a, let's say, it's University of Florida in Gainesville, then I want to mask. I want to use general geographic terms to avoid identifying the locations. So let's say I'm interviewing professors in higher ed. Well, I don't want it to be, I don't want to say Gainesville, Florida, university professors in ethics that I'm trying to ask about something, because you might be able to identify them. We want to do everything we can to protect the identity of our participants in order to get real, honest answers. And so we want to use general geographic terms to avoid identifying the location. We don't want anybody's job at risk. We want honest answers. And so we'd say southeastern a large higher education institution in southeastern United States. And so that's the site. Always just refer to the region of the world or the United States or whatever country you're working with. Don't provide the exact location, and sort of don't say the University of Florida in the southeastern United States. Again, don't give away the location, mask it. This is to avoid compromising confidentiality or anonymity, as well as using pseudonyms. If you're doing a qualitative study, you often point to direct individual quotes, and you want to say participant A1 or C11, whatever they are that you've come up with as sort of an alphanumeric coding process to identify the individuals. Normally you don't identify individuals in quantitative studies, but you might say there were several outliers, observation or participant 392 had very high, so it could be a case, but normally you'll just use a number in those cases. Again, do not exceed one paragraph or one page. So I think I've covered everything I want to cover here. I'll come back to this if I want to add some more, but hopefully that will set you up for looking into your framework which will come next. I'll meet you back there in our next video. Thank you.